Your Excellencies, dear guests, good morning and welcome to Sarajevo. Thank you for joining us, the European Union External Action Service and European Union in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as we mark 1 year since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The event, Connecting Media Communities in the Age of Disinformation, brought us here together to discuss the challenges that media communities and civil society face in the modern world. My name is Marija Ćosić, and I'm honored to be your host today. Please welcome Ambasador Johann Sattler, Head of EU Delegation and EU Special Representative to Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Good morning, dobro jutro. Dear colleagues, friends, it gives me great pleasure to welcome such a crowd today here in Sarajevo. We have colleagues from the region, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, from neighboring countries. We have colleagues from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, obviously, but also from Armenia, from Georgia. We have colleagues from the Middle East, from Asia, from the United States. Very happy, and I'm very thankful for all of you to have made it here today to Sarajevo. Today, a year ago, hell broke loose. Hell broke loose for 42 million Ukrainians. Today, a year ago, the invasion, the full-scale invasion, the war of aggression of Russia against a peaceful country, against Ukraine started. And since then, we are waking up to the horrors. We are waking up to new pictures of horrors every day. People being killed, civilians massively being targeted, people being maimed, civilians on a massive scale suffering. And today we honor the victims of this monstrous aggression, but we also pay tribute to the Ukrainian resolve and resilience. It's still hard to believe that war has once again returned to Europe. This date, the 24th of February of 22, fundamentally changed lives in Europe and beyond. And the news and images coming out of Ukraine, and today will be no different, and it might be even worse. They send shockwaves around the world, not just because of what it means for Ukraine, but also because it's such a brazen violation of international laws and norms, and it undermines the European and global security frameworks. However, during this war, we also saw lots of images of courage, of strength, of images of brave Ukrainian women and men defending their country, defending their livelihoods. Few understand this better than people here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and especially here in Sarajevo, which has gone through this terrible 4-year siege, which cost the lives of more than 10,000 people. The European Union, its member states, the United States, and our closest allies and partners have stood by Ukraine and will remain united in supporting it in face of military brutality. However, this war is not just about the battlefield, not just about military. It's not only waged on the battlefield, but it's also waged, of course, in the information space. And this is what we are here for today and tomorrow, discussing exactly this. It's about influencing the mind, affecting the spirit, and understanding of people from all over the world. The mechanisms for information manipulation that Russia has created years ago, and it's, as our Ukrainian colleague just said before in the press conference, it didn't start a year ago, of course. It started for you 9 years ago, but it even goes back further because there were aggressions before. War propaganda and disinformation efforts aim to shift the blame on Ukraine, on NATO, on the European Union, and more broadly on the West. The goal is to justify the aggression, to undermine support for Ukraine and polarize our societies. And this is not new. It's unfortunately become an integral part of any war. What is new are the technologies being used and probably the scale, enabling anyone to reach audiences worldwide in ways never seen before. Current media trends indicate that increasingly people tend to take information from places that exactly corroborate their own opinions, their own views. And if these places are then also used to spread disinformation and false information, citizens do not understand what is going on and are not able to make informed choices. This is a vicious circle and indeed a tool of war. It is a weapon on the intellect and a weapon on free thinking. As such, it is designed to weaken public resolve, shake our democratic foundations, and influence the manner of European support for Ukraine. This is meant to delay any chance of stopping this aggression and saving innocent lives. This is the issue that has to be addressed, and this is what we are doing also today. The Ukrainian poet Lesya Ukrainka once said, "Nad всіх старшин найстарша правда." In rough translation, it means of all the wisdoms, the oldest one is truth. We have no doubt that despite Russia's monstrous disinformation campaign at all levels, truth in the end will prevail. Today we welcome to Sarajevo journalists, fact-checkers, media professionals, academics, and representatives of civil society from different countries and continents to take part in our conference, Connecting Media Communities in the Age of Disinformation. Today's event will help better understanding of the issue of information manipulation and enhancing synergies across borders to respond and prevail in the face of common threats. This cannot be done without cooperation, and here the European Union, of course, has teamed up. We are working with our partners in your regions to enhance societal resilience against these threats. We are supporting media freedom, pluralism, media literacy to counter disinformation, protect and strengthen our democracy. And we not only do it by talking the talk, we also there with support, with financial support in order to help fighting this information war. Integrity, professional journalism, and strong civil society are crucial during war times when information manipulation takes place and disinformation spreads. They are the foundations of resistance. Having this event on this day here in Sarajevo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, carries, as I said before, also symbolic value. The war in Ukraine brings back painful memories of the war here. The remembrance is enhanced by the fact that social media enable us to see these events almost live from the perspective of ordinary citizens. This is more than information, more than a piece of news. It is, and I quote, live broadcast of the experience in the war zone, as described by Alexander Hammond, a well-known American author of Bosnia-Herzegovina origin. These personal accounts, along with professional media reporting, are our window into the events in Ukraine, which will be relied upon for years to come, which is why your role and the work of the media community is extremely, extremely important. And I'm profoundly thankful for your bravery in such dangerous circumstances. And I wish to also use this moment to honor the media professionals who have given their lives in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of reporting and bringing facts to the people. Democracy, peace, diversity, equality, and respect for human rights are at the heart of European values. We will stand together in defending these values and returning peace to Europe and to Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!
Ambassador Sattler, thank you very much. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, editor of a fact-checking platform from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Raskrinkavanje, Tijana Cvjetićanin. Raskrinkavanje wrote 6 analyses of most frequent narratives about Russia's invasion of Ukraine that were present in media in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region. I will invite you to the stage now and tell us more details about the Raskrinkavanje analysis.
Thank you, Maria. So hi, my name is Tijana. Oh, this disappeared. Why? Okay. Do you see there? No. It's just gone. The presentation is gone. Okay, there we go. So, hi again. In 2022, in February, full-scale invasion on Ukraine started, and it really kind of made ripples in disinformation world in here as it did, I assume, across the globe. So what we did is we went through all of the materials that we acquired through the fact-checking that we do, and we have done over 4,500 pieces of disinformation we have debunked during 2022. And this is media articles, social media posts, all types of content that reached us through various signals that we get from our audience, from the platforms, etc. And what we did is an analysis of that material for the time period of from January to October last year. And we found we found something that we call disinformation narratives. This is not listening to me at all. I don't know why. Okay. Help? No. Okay. So what we found is 22 disinformation narratives. And then we did an analysis using this methodology. We did a quantitative analysis of that, and we did qualitative analysis of the material that we acquired. The quantitative analysis was counting of how many sources and pieces of disinformation and fact-checking articles we published. And then we also weighted that using a scale on like how important, how relative those narratives are. For example, if something was published by, I don't know, a public broadcaster, we consider that to be more relevant than something that just appeared as like an anonymous post on social networks. If something had both global and local and regional relevance, we would consider that to be more important than something that was just relevant for local context or for regional context. So using this combination of quantitative and qualitative methodology, we found these narratives and then we ranked them. In defining what the disinformation narrative was, we saw this as a way to frame the world, to frame events, to frame worldviews using disinformation. So these would be stories that are based on false premises and that are consciously used to tell a false story. And this is something that is not always present when we talk about misinformation and disinformation. Some misinformation is just like a single incorrect statement, but disinformation narratives are something that spans for longer than just like one news cycle, and that is kind of consciously created to mislead the public. So we found 22 of those. And we found this in this material that you see, that this number of material that you see on your screen, where about half of the material that we created, that we produced, would pertain in some way to some kind of disinformation narrative. So using the methodology that I mentioned and using this criteria, we try to single out like what are the most important, the most relative and the most dominant disinformation narratives that we found in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also the region, because a lot of what we fact check comes from outside or spreads outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So narratives about Ukraine, about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, were by and large the most dominant in the sample. When all are taken together, all the disinformation that we rated that are in some way about Ukraine, it would account for over 1,000 of pieces of debunked content, which is when it comes to other groups of narratives, such as the narratives about anti-vaccination narrative or the so-called pandemic narrative, was the largest and the most present one in our sample. So this is the narratives that we found, the 6 most dominant narratives that we found, and all are parroting talking points that basically Vladimir Putin set out in his speech when he announced the invasion on Ukraine in February 2022. And all are basically convincing people to embrace this worldview that is offered by Russian state war propaganda. First of those narratives is the one that portrays Ukraine as a nuclear threat or as a country that poses threat of use of bioweapons. And a prominent staple of that narrative is a story about US military biolabs that are supposedly being built in Ukraine to test or experiment or create biologically based Russian DNA based weapons, something that doesn't exist in reality. But it has been believed by a lot of people. It has been embraced by a lot of conspiracy theorists, such as QAnon, followers and those types of groups. And we have even seen it peddled by the embassy of Russian Federation in Bosnia and Herzegovina that stood really strongly behind it, so to speak. So nuclear weapon, Ukraine as a nuclear threat was also quite prominent because it's based on literally nothing. Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's not doing anything to develop nuclear weapons, but it's not how it's portrayed by Russian propaganda sources. The narrative where Russian military is glorified is not new, as most of these are not new. It's been there for a while, and we've seen it in a lot of these outlets, such as, Sputnik Serbia, that's been kind of radiating this type of propaganda for years. We've seen this glorification of Russian military being portrayed as something almost sci-fi level military. And this has been really present, especially in the early days of invasion, where it went hand in hand with kind of a triumphalist discourse where Russia was cheered on to attack Ukraine, to annihilate Ukraine in some cases. This usually came from kind of right-wing sources in the region, and it was based on kind of making up some sort of military successes that weren't really there, and portraying Russia's military strategy as almost genius. And something that came hand in hand with that also was the claim that it never targeted any civilian targets, that it never committed any war crimes. It was just like high precision weapons targeting military targets, which was not true. Another one is kind of a narrative that was laid out to explain why the war even started. And it was portrayed as Russia defending itself rather than attacking another country. And it was said it was defending itself from NATO. It has its roots in this political myth that's decades old, that somehow NATO has promised at the end of the Cold War that it will not expand to the east, and broken that promise, and that endangered Russia. This was the proto-narrative that this one is based on, and it is quite, I think this was the one that was most represented in our sample, saying that this is not an invasion and not an aggression of Russia on Ukraine, but a proxy war that NATO is leading against Russia. Sometimes even claiming that NATO is actually present in theater and it has, people in actual combat in Ukraine, which is also not true. Another one that is particularly bitter, I would say, is accusing Ukraine of being a Nazi state. This goes hand in hand with kind of denying that Ukraine is even a state. It's paradoxical, but most of these are. It says that Ukraine is not a democratic country that has a government that's been democratically elected, but it's actually run by a Nazi regime that used a coup to come to power. So in his speech, again, we return to that speech a lot in our analysis as well, Vladimir Putin said that the Russian soldiers are coming there to liberate their brothers from this Nazi regime, and invited the Ukraine military to surrender, portraying anything other than surrender as an actual aggression on their liberators. It's really a lot of insane twists and turns, but this is how this propaganda narrative is built, and I'm afraid also believed by a lot of people. So another thing that's a part of this narrative is accusing Ukraine of committing or trying or planning to commit genocide against Russian-speaking population in the territories that Russia has annexed, and this is also something that we have been hearing in one way or another for years. Another one that's not related directly to the war and is a bit different in that respect is a story that sanctions that had been put in place against Russia are not hurting Russia, but are actually only hurting the countries that have, come up with sanctions against Russia. And they're portrayed as a way like a boomerang that is kind of returning to the European countries and hurting them. And we have seen a lot of apocalyptic announcements of Europe freezing during the winter without the Russian gas, or food shortages endangering people's lives, etc., while Russia is untouched by sanctions, and in some versions of this narrative even getting stronger because of them, because it's kind of looking inward and developing its own economy. In the analysis that Maria mentioned, we have published very thorough, in-depth analysis of each of these narratives, and we have wonderful insight from people from Russia, journalists from Russia, fact-checkers from Russia, about what really is the case with the effect of sanctions against Russia, rather than what we can see in these propagandist narratives. This one is personally most interesting to me because we call it something that is fake news about fake news. And this is also a decades-old tactic, I think, even, going back way to the beginning of the Cold War, where Western media are portrayed as doing something that the Russian state media are actually doing. This means that they're not, that there is no freedom of media in the West, that the Western media are actually just peddling their own state's propaganda, that they are trying to build an unrealistic image of Russia as an aggressor in Ukraine, and that they are staging their reports, that they are using false information, that they are using actors, et cetera, to portray crimes that Russia is committing in Ukraine. This is also something that we have seen in the region during the 90s, and here is this example of like real congruence between these narratives, where we had, like in Serbia, for example, there was a very similar official propaganda calling every report about war crimes a lie, a staged slander of Serbia, that's being done out of Serbophobia, just like we're hearing about Russophobia now, et cetera. So this has been used by a lot of these sources in the region that are like right-wing nationalist sources. They really have like a template that they can just like, fill with new content using the same kind of, structure. Which gives me a good segue into a bit of statistics that we saw in the material that we made. Serbia is actually, the media in Serbia are the most dominant source of this type of narratives in the region. So we have Sputnik Serbia operating from there. And while, for example, RT, former Russia Today, has been prevented from working in a lot of countries, it has started a new outlet in Serbia recently. So you can really see that the media sphere that is very favorable to these narratives. And the media that you see on the screen are all based in Serbia, but one, InfoRS, which is based in Montenegro. Not a single one of these, the top 10 transmitters of these narratives, are based in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This doesn't mean that there aren't any, because there are. And unfortunately, some of them are actually public broadcasters like RTRS, or a public news agency like, like Crna. And but they usually act as transmitters of these stories, not their sources. So where we see the sources is basically tabloids from Serbia and Sputnik Serbia, like the outlet of Sputnik in BiH language, is definitely at the center of this hub that kind of radiates those types of narratives. So the analysis of all of this, each of these 6 narratives is available in both English and our language on our website, and we will also publish the full report of the more detail, about statistics that we saw and the ways that they are transmitted, and of course the way that they evolved during the past year of invasion in Ukraine. So now I go to thank you and thank you. Yes, do I go there?
Thank you, Tijana. Thank you. We're going to move on for the rest of the program with the panel Evolution of Propaganda Narratives on Ukraine. We'll just give a quick second to take that off the stage, and then I'll announce the other speakers that are going to be here with us alongside Tijana. Thank you. So here today, speaking on the panel, we have Johann Sattler, Editor-in-Chief of Stop Fake from Ukraine. Marija Vučić, journalist from Crime and Corruption Reporting Network. Iyad El-Baghdadi, Director of Jamal Khashoggi Disinformation Monitor. And Sead Turčalo, Dean of the Faculty of Political Sciences and University of Sarajevo. Just put this down. Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining me on stage. We've heard Tijana's presentation about the most frequent narratives we've seen in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region. As she explained, some of them can be traced back all the way to the initial Putin speech that took place a year ago today. She told us about the narratives that were present here, but Mr. Ferchenko, can you tell us more about the Russian disinformation narratives and propaganda targeting Ukraine before the start of the full-scale invasion and how that kind of evolved throughout the past year? Are there any new tactics, new tools employed to spread these narratives?
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's very important that we mark anniversary of full-scale invasion with the topic of disinformation, because disinformation was not only the thing that accompanied this war, because you might say that every war is accompanied by disinformation, but this war was prepared by disinformation, it was pre-organized by disinformation and prerequisited. So my team was following Russian disinformation since occupation of Crimea. It's almost 9 years. And what we've seen was a huge role disinformation played in the role of Russia's military buildup before leading to this invasion. And also the data we collected and analyzed allowed us to actually predict this full-scale invasion based on the volume of disinformation, intensity of the messages. And of course, I totally agree with the conclusions my colleagues did about main narratives which were pushed by Russia. But also, if we look a little bit back, we would see how those narratives were built up in time. So when we talk about fake news, we usually understand kind of one-time events which are manufactured by disinformation. But when we talk about narratives, we should understand that it's a kind of a long process of storytelling where all this single piece of fake news are intervened into some narrative which need to stick to the people's minds, and they need to recognize it when they hear it the next time. So that's exactly what disinformation was systematically from day to day, doing that for years and years. So from our point of view, is very important to understand this process, to realize how huge was the role of disinformation and those people who participate in this. And also when people are always asking what Ukraine expects at the end of this war, the answer is that it's not only the military victory, but also justice, which is also including the punishment on those who manufactured this system, participate till this day in this system, even when it's absolutely obvious that those disinformation, or how they call it, journalism, is literally killing people. I would say not only helps to kill people, but is killing people, and every narrative that you mention actually supports the direct military action. So even if it would take some of those, the most widespread narratives like Ukraine as a nuclear state, or Ukraine developing secret biolaboratories, or the Ukraine is a fascist state, all those narratives were leading to dehumanization of Ukrainians on one hand as people, and delegitimization of Ukraine as a real state, which actually made the aggression acceptable from Russian point of view. Also, there is a second point which is very, very important, and now in a year after full-scale invasion, we see that happening in the media. For example, yesterday there was an interesting article in the Financial Times saying that Putin took the decision about this invasion absolutely kind of impromptu, not taking advice from anyone. And as Minister Lavrov says that he has only 3 advisors, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great, you know. So that brings us to the very dangerous conclusion that if we talk about this as an absolutely irrational approach to conducting this war, that means that all those people who were helping to prepare the grounds for this war are absolutely innocent. But again, from Ukrainian point of view, we look at this very systematically, and we stress that this system was elaborated and developed for at least last 9 years. And so we need to look at this as a kind of systematic work with a lot of people involved. And again, if we go back to the problem of justice, that means that those people should take responsibility for those actions and get punished for that. So that's kind of our approach. And as you said, we really been following all those narratives. We collected all the materials which were produced by Russian disinformation through this period of time. And we look at those pieces of disinformation as legal evidences, if you wish, which can be used and should be used for prosecution of those who created this system.
You said that, yes, you've seen the narratives that Tijana mentioned also in Ukraine. Were there any other commonly present that kind of failed to reach our region?
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about the narratives, they are generally the same for every region with some differences. But what is important is that not in all the regions, disinformation has the same impact. So this is the difference, because in some areas there is a very kind of either bigger resilience towards disinformation or bigger skepticism towards Russian disinformation. Or there are legal limitations, like after sanctions were adopted against Russian disinformation outlets in the European Union, United States, and some other countries. But we should remember that there are many other countries that did not take any steps to fight this disinformation machine, and they are allowing this disinformation to be fully present, which means that the impact of disinformation is still visible over there, and there are huge audiences to that disinformation. So, because on one hand we can say, yeah, we already know everything about Russian disinformation. We know main actors, main narratives, main platforms, we know how to fight them. But the question is, either we really do that, and if we do that on a global level, because you cannot fight disinformation in one single place and then leave it intact in many other places. So probably the main lesson for us here was that we really needed to internationalize our efforts to fight disinformation much earlier, not on February 24th last year. And in that case, we would have a much bigger effect to minimize the malign effects of disinformation system.
Thank you. And Mr. al-Baghdadi, what about the Middle East and North Africa region? Were there similar narratives present there? And more importantly, would you say that the spread of these disinformation narratives kind of differ targeting the audience in the MENA region from the ones when they target the one in the Western countries?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I feel the weight on my shoulders because in the panel, I believe I'm the only one who's bringing a perspective outside of Europe. So I will be speaking about the Middle East and North Africa, which is the region that we monitor, but we also frequently see narratives from beyond the region as well. There is a fundamental difference in the way that Russia uses disinformation towards Europe versus towards the rest of the world. One thing that struck me when I sit with colleagues from Europe, particularly the Baltic states, I live in Oslo in Norway. And so, you know, especially in the Baltic states, they are constantly facing Russian disinformation. And what struck me is that a lot of their effort is about debunking. So there's fake news and they debunk the fake news. This is very different from the way it is in the Middle East. I think maybe it's useful to simply start by telling you who are the main actors in the Middle East and North Africa region. Of course, there is Russian disinformation. The Iranians produce a lot of disinformation as well, even though their disinformation network is more decentralized. So they have multiple proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis, etc., who mainly produce a lot of their Arabic language disinformation. The Saudis and the Emiratis are also high volume producers of disinformation. The Turks, Turkey, or the Turkish space, is also important, but by far the biggest, the superpower, disinformation superpower in the region when it comes to the space itself is the Israeli space. Not only in terms of producing disinformation, but also providing technology for disinformation for other actors. So the region has been a target for Russian disinformation much longer than the Ukraine war, as you know. I think the seminal point was really the Russian intervention in Syria. And we see that some of the most successful campaigns, I believe, of disinformation was really targeting Syrians in the end. We all remember, for example, the conspiracy theory about the white helmets being Al-Qaeda, which was used to justify bombing cities such as Aleppo, creating big waves of refugees, etc., which are still suffering until today. So the region has been targeted with this kind of Russian disinformation from that period of time. So by the time the Ukraine war started, the general impression in the region, keep in mind, disinformation is not just about false information or misleading information. It's about what lies about you people are willing to believe and spread on their own. So we also want to look at, there is disinformation that is very easy to notice because you see that it's being artificially promoted, but there's other disinformation which actually gets a lot of organic support. And this is the most dangerous one. Sometimes we even have to think twice, is this really disinformation? Because it's getting a lot of organic support. So when the war started, Russia did not have a very good, didn't have that much of a psychological penetration in the region. This is because a lot of the Arabic-speaking publics still remember what Russia did to Syria. And they have a lot of sympathy with the Syrians. And some of us, are old enough to remember, what side Russia took in Bosnia and in Chechnya, etc., who are also, there's a lot of also support based upon commonality of religion. So early on, in the beginnings of the war, there was a mix of confusion and support, sympathy with Ukraine. The idea, of course, it's very simple to see that this is a country that's being invaded by a bully. It is being, this bully is basically trying to rob it of its own independence, it's denying its existence, etc. So there was a lot of organic support and sympathy with Ukraine. This is, of course, combined with the fact that people in the region already saw what Russian disinformation looks like, and they already did not have a lot of sympathy in many cases for Russia's narratives. And so it's not that they did not spread these narratives that were presented. They did, but they did not make a lot of impact. They didn't have a lot of penetration. This, I feel, changed about maybe a few weeks into the war, maybe in March, between March and May, really. There was a sea change. There was like a kind of inflection point. And I think two things really happened, which led to this change. I think the New York Times just yesterday, as marking 1 year of the invasion, actually published an article which is talking about the diplomatic situation, the diplomatic isolation of Russia. And it compared the very early UN votes and how isolated Russia was when it was beginning the invasion, and how that slowly changed. The picture slowly changed, and more countries were actually less supportive and more willing to actually take Russia's side or take a side of neutrality. And I think that there's a progression here as well, because between March and May, one incident that happened is that in many Western media, especially English-speaking media, there was this. I don't believe it is organic, but it did happen that there was this comparison between Ukrainian refugees and Middle Eastern refugees, and words that are being used such as civilized, uncivilized. That, of course, was giving free fodder for Russian disinformation. Russian disinformation in this case does not have to create a fake story. They just have to take these clips by European or American journalists saying, these are civilized refugees, unlike the uncivilized refugees, and they can just pump it. They can just promote it. And that itself had a huge impact. In fact, many people there are many people who are apathetic. They only started really paying attention to Ukraine when this happened. And so this was very damaging to Western narratives in the region. And again, like I said, Russian networks exploited that. The second thing that happened because they always play on this double standards. The second thing that happened in May was the murder of the Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in Palestine. Shireen was a well-known journalist, and she was a face that was known to many Arab households because she had a long career, 20 plus years. And so there was a lot, of course, of sympathy with that, but also there was, again, pumping more and more about Western double standards, that when this happens anywhere else in the world, Western countries take a very firm stand, but when it comes to this particular part of the world, the response is completely different. And so these two incidents gave the Russian disinformation this opportunity to pump a different kind of narrative. So it's not really about pumping fake news, but basically saying you should not sympathize with the West because the West has double standards. The West looks at you in a supremacist way, in a racist way, and that achieved a lot of penetration. And I believe this continued. And what was really striking for me was really the number of regional regimes. And I think this is something maybe I should have led with, because even before the invasion, we could see that there is disinformation produced by networks of regional networks that signaled what they were willing to do. Especially the Saudi disinformation network and the Emirati disinformation network. We saw that there's a lot of pro-Putin messages, not from official sources, of course, but we already saw that they recognized that a war in Ukraine would be beneficial to them because of the oil situation. So that would, of course, give them a lot more income, but also it will give them leverage, because in that case, the West cannot cut off Russia from the world economy and also other oil producers at the same time. So they recognize that this is actually useful for them. In the specific case of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, it was clear that he wanted to use this as political leverage towards some kind of deal with the United States, because as you remember, the Biden administration at that time did not really, Biden made some promises that he doesn't want to meet him. But also, I think Mohammed bin Salman has personal liking of Putin, and he had like a strong relationship with Putin, so going back to 2018. And so what really struck me throughout this is that there are so many networks, whether it's the Turkish networks or the Iranian ones or the Russian ones or even the Gulf ones, that is pushing back Western influence. So even what's supposed to be a Western ally, such as Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, you see in their networks also a lot of Western double standards. They're trying to push back Western influence and use Russia almost as a bargaining chip in order to get better, some kind of leverage when it comes to their political situation, political relationship with the West. I think I'll stop here. I think it's important also, of course, to salute the courage and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. I don't want people to get the impression that because I'm talking about these double standards, that it doesn't mean that we do not support Ukraine. Of course we do. It's just that I wish, the people in the region wish that Western countries and European countries, European Union, have the same standards everywhere in the world.
Thank you. You also mentioned a bit about localization of the narratives depending on the region they're targeting. We've seen that here, which is official narrative that is being spread from Russia is somewhat changed and adapted to local situation and being pushed like that to a certain audience in order to make it more influential for them. For example, here we've seen claims about attacks on Ukraine being faked, as well as the attacks on Bosnia and Herzegovina were back in the 90s. So maybe, Maria, can you tell us something about the localization of the narratives in our region?
Thank you. Well, I think that what you mentioned is the biggest one. If you read, for example, Serbian newspapers, you're going to conclude that every Russian attack, what is actually a Russian attack on Ukraine, is basically a false flag operation conducted by Ukrainians themselves, the same way as in Yugoslavia in 90s, because we have to, when I say we, I mean general public in Serbia, led by mainstream media, pro-regime media, of course. We have to justify Russian actions in order to, I would say, resolve this cognitive dissonance we've been living in for a year, because what we experienced is very similar with what Ukraine is experiencing right now. We have the experience of NATO bombing from 1999. We know how it feels to have this collective trauma, to have civilians killed and infrastructure destroyed, of course. And we also have a situation with the territory which declared independence. So in many aspects, when we're talking about the localization, there are many parallels that the general public in Serbia is drawing between those two situations. So it would be logical, I think, for the public in Serbia to stand by Ukraine in this case, to empathize with Ukraine, because we know how it feels to be attacked. We know how it feels to have a territory declaring its independence. But at the same time, we are very, by sentiment, Serbia is very Russophilia country, I would say. And of course, Russia is Serbian political ally in United Nations regarding to Kosovo. So we keep that in mind, and we have to, as I said, solve this cognitive dissonance. Instead of being on Ukrainian side, we are somehow like in this twisted, perverted mental acrobatics. We found a way to stand by the aggressor, because in this case, the aggressor is our friend. So we are going to do everything to justify it. And we do that by building a narrative that it's NATO's fault. The same as it was in 1999 when we suffered NATO bombings. The same goes for this situation. It's not Russians' fault, what's going on in Ukraine. It's not Russians' fault. Russia is not a villain. Russia is not a bad guy. It's NATO in this case again. So when you read NATO, that actually provoked the answer, the response by Russia. Russia is only defending itself. So this is the narrative that is being built in Serbian mainstream media since the beginning of the war. There are many media articles in mainstream newspapers, for example, Večernje Novosti, which is the biggest nationalistic propaganda newspaper since ever. This is the newspaper that actually in the past built the same narrative during Yugoslavia civil war. It's Serbs cannot be villains ever. Our military leaders cannot be villains. What happened in Bosnia was somehow a wrongdoing by Bosniaks or the West. And the same narrative is actually being translated to this situation. And I assume, and there's some evidence for that, that it's not that Serbia is so much in love with Russia, as much is in hate with the West because of historical events. And my newsroom published an analysis, razkrinkavanje.rs, published an analysis. We were actually monitoring how mainstream newspapers in Serbia reported on the war for the first 6 months of the war. And we discovered in the first place that majority of those articles published about the war were heavily biased. Many of them were not, of course. Many of them were like statements, cold factual statements about the war. But many of them were actually biased articles aimed to slowly but steadily build a narrative about the war. And many of them, I think 2/3 of those biased articles were not only pro-Russian, but I would say at a larger amount, they were anti-West. So this is what is Serbian specificum, I would say, the specificum of Serbian media. It's important to maintain a narrative about the evil West and the good East. And I'm not trying to say that the West is good and that there are no like wrongdoings on both sides. I'm a journalist, I'm not into politics, I don't care. I know that there are interests on both sides, but by building this biased narrative, you are using a lot of disinformation, you're using a lot of lies. For example, events like Bucha, events like many other in this war are completely staged. So this is the narrative that is being translated to social media. So ordinary people, when you ask them, they are claiming that Ukrainians are actually killing their own civilians. So that would be it for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Turčalo, can you tell us more about the implications of invasion on Ukraine that it has on Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region? Has it kind of impacted the political and security situation here, and what kind of particular implications can we see?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'll start with some actually positive impacts that the failure of a Russian military operation, then Ukrainian resistance, had on Bosnia and the Western Balkans. Just the weeks before the Russian aggression on Ukraine, the entity of Republika Srpska, their government started or launched the largest political attack on the statehood and the sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina by trying to take over the competences from the state in the field of security, and trying actually or attempting to re-establish the armed forces of Republika Srpska, which are found guilty in front of the International Criminal Tribunal for the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was an immediate threat to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we saw that actually it was in a kind of cooperation with Russia, which was later confirmed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, in a telephone conversation with Milorad Dodik, then the member of the Bosnian's presidency. And those Russian puppets in the region, political players in the region, they were really shocked by the failure of this Russian military operations. They remained even silent for a few weeks, although their media, and we know that the media are controlled by Vučić in Serbia, and all of the public broadcast or even private-owned media in Republika Srpska are very under the control or the pressure by the Dodik's government. They continued this support for Vladimir Putin by airing this Oliver Stone interview with Vladimir Putin, offering him as a role model to the society. They're continuing with this or refabricating this kind of replicating this kind of discourse that they used in the 1990s when speaking about the aggression on Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. In case if Moscow had been more successful in seizing Kiev and overthrowing the democratically elected government, I'm pretty sure that the regimes in Belgrade and Banja Luka would have started organizing street riots and some plebiscite decision regarding Republika Srpska or even Kosovo and the Northern Macedonia. But we should not rule out this scenario. If we listening to the State of Union by Putin, in case that Russia is brought to the knees in Ukraine, it has at least 4 launch pads for destabilizing or starting a conflict in the Western Balkans and to extend the front to the Western Balkans. It's Republika Srpska, it is Northern Kosovo, it is Montenegro, and to a certain extent even the entire Serbia. There are still these pro-Russian politicians in main positions in the security sector in Serbia, just like spreading this Serbian world narrative, which is something what's very similar, or which would fit in the Russian world as such, and putting Bosnia and Herzegovina and the entire region in a kind of a waiting phase. What is the possible scenario? What's the possible outcome? We have seen a good response by the Western division of international community, how I call it, when it comes to the aggression in Ukraine. But on the other hand, what this Western division of international community did in the Western Balkans, they actually tried to stabilize the region by appeasing these pro-Russian political forces. Vučić, Dodik, some of them in Montenegro, and as much as they showed that they are in the line with the Russian policy, with the Russian foreign policy, and attempting to move Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, from NATO path, the Western division of international community actually started more heavily to appease them. And we have seen it in Bosnia and Herzegovina that another narrative started speaking about Dodik again as a new political force, and we have seen in 1997 what it means to call Dodik a fresh breath of air. We actually created a monster, and we are now defeating this monster by offering them more power in security sector, more power in intelligence, more power in the main areas where he then will be able to spread all of this actually Russian narratives and converting them into policies. At the end, our state government even agreed not to put NATO integration in this like government program, which is a clear message that this kind of being pro-Russian or like organizing even parades or riots, parades, and by supporting Putin as being avoided. And it has to really to change, because all this scenario that I just mentioned, Bosnia, Serbia, Northern Macedonia, and Montenegro as a launchpad for extending the Russian front against the West to the Western Balkans is very feasible.
Thank you. And Mr. al-Baghdadi, what about the MENA region? What implications do you see there, and what, in your opinion, could kind of be the consequences of this kind of narratives being spread in that region?
I assume you mean security.
Yeah.
Okay. So Russia has, as you know, an active military presence in Syria. And early on, some of the earliest speculations about what this will mean, especially when it became clear that this war is not going in Russia's favor, that this is Russia is not going to have an easy victory in Ukraine and might actually face defeat in Ukraine. The first speculation really was, what does this mean for Syria? What does it mean for the Assad regime? And at that time, we saw a lot of kind of very basically diplomatic activity. We saw, for example, visits by kind of bilateral talks, or at least some approach by the United Arab Emirates towards the Assad regime, more recently by the Saudi regime towards the Assad regime. Obviously, these talks are really about the future, about what kind of situation will happen, because as you know, Russia's partner in actually more partner plus partner sometimes, and sometimes competitor in Syria, is the Iranian regime. And the Iranian regime, as you know, is a complicated situation, but the Iranian regime is also very much opposed by the Gulf states and Israel. And so this was the first question, of course. As you also know, the Wagner group is also active in Libya and also active elsewhere in Africa. And so the first indications that we were looking for is Russia or is Wagner pulling troops anywhere? Is it like reducing its impact or its footprint elsewhere in the region? So far, this doesn't seem to be the case because a lot of the Wagner militias are local recruits. But it remains the case that there's a lot of speculation there about what happens if this gets even worse for Russia. What kind of consideration, what kind of security architecture is going to exist in the region? We saw a lot of activity from Turkish networks. Obviously, Turkey sees a potential Russian drawback from Syria as an opportunity. But other actors, of course, see it as a risk. It's also important to mention that another very important consideration when it comes to the region is the agricultural field and the impact on grain imports to the region. As you know, like a country like Egypt, for example, is I think the country in the world that imports the most grain. Algeria is number 3 in that list. And of course, Algeria doesn't get a lot of it. It actually gets most of its agricultural import from France, but also recently, like right before the war, it had started actually also importing from Russia. So this has elevated elevated a lot of anxiety among, especially in Egypt. What happens if, because of this inflation in the price of bread, what happens if this meets the security challenges and the political challenges of worsening standard of living, especially in a country where with a history of popular uprisings such as in Egypt. The third area I think which is important to mention, other than military and political and agriculture, is really in the disinformation space itself. And I was reminded, as my colleagues were speaking, there's a little detail that maybe people have not caught up on, but just yesterday, Alexander Dugin, who is, as you know, Putin's brain, and a philosopher of Russian nationalism. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Dugin. He actually made an appearance yesterday on Saudi television on Al Arabiya. And he was basically spouting his ideology to Arabs and actually trying to say, I like Arabs, I like Muslims. So basically, it's almost like there are actors in the region that see this as an opportunity. And of course, what the Saudis did at the same time is that they also hosted the First Lady of Ukraine also in an interview to kind of say that we are balanced. But I think the picture is actually more complicated than that. I think security-wise, long-term, I think there's also a final factor to mention, which is the oil. Russia's involvement in the region is not only, as you know, like Russia has long relations with some of the regimes in the Middle East and North Africa. Algeria is, of course, an example, going back to Soviet times, disrupted by the fall of the Soviet Union, but continuing after that. But a lot of its presence in the region is not only, a lot of us sometimes see it only of the prism that Russia is in the Middle East in order to push back against Western influence and to try to use the region as a bargaining chip or as leverage. But there are other considerations, and one of the most important is that it needs some leverage, or it sees both a leverage and a relationship with highly oil-producing countries in the region, such as the Gulf states and Iran. And Russia has been skilled, in this case, in maintaining relations with both, even though the region sometimes looks as basically the Gulf states and Israel in an alliance against Iran and its proxies. But Russia actually managed to build a working relationship with both sides. And this is important for Russia because Russia, it's an oil-producing country. It's a country which is almost a rentier state. It's actually almost completely dependent upon hydrocarbon exports. And so there has been some sort of mutual accommodation when it comes to the oil market. Final thing I'll mention is basically weapons exports, which is, as Russia, its influence, because it's being cut off in many areas, it can't export a lot of its hydrocarbons to Europe, etc. The other leg, so for a lot of its imports, is really defense industry, defense exports, and there are many regional players. Egyptian army, for example, the Algerian army specifically, which is equipped with Russian military hardware. And so for them, it's very important for them to, for the modernization of their army, the continuation of their army is, for them, it is in their interest that Russia continues to be a weapons exporter. And of course, this is being stressed now because Russia needs all of the military hardware at once in order to prosecute its war in Ukraine. So I don't think that the security implications of Russia's involvement, Russia's overextension, is positive for the Middle East and North Africa. I think it's actually going to be quite negative, given that the region itself is still very unstable.
And to kind of focus that even a bit more, what about the security situation for your team and you? Have you experienced any threats or attacks?
Well, as you notice from the name, I mean, our disinformation monitor is named after Jamal Khashoggi, who, as you know, was murdered for his work. And the idea of our disinformation monitor really arose in conversations between me and Jamal that happened in 2018, a few weeks before he was killed. People know Jamal as a journalist, but he was also very keenly interested in disinformation in the public sphere and what it can mean for press freedom and freedom of speech. And so pretty much our team was created in an atmosphere of heightened security threats against my team, myself as well. In fact, it was in 2019 that I was placed under protection myself. I continue to be under protection in Norway. What's interesting here is the security threats are not coming from Russian nodes. They're actually coming from Western allies. The two most important exporters of this kind of threats, of course, it's the Saudis, who are most directly have this network of strategy of transnational repression, but the equipment and the software and the material part of this also, it comes largely from Israel, both the disinformation and hacking technology, et cetera, et cetera. And we actually just saw a very big story that broke the news last week, which I think is very important for all disinformation analysts in the world, which is it was a collaboration called Forbidden Stories, and it uncovered a small team of disinformation professionals, mercenaries, if you would say, operating out of Israel, and who have they claim to have hacked 30 elections. Just for scale, there are 90 countries in the world where there are elections at all. So this is talking 1/3 of elections in the world, and they claim to have succeeded in 28 or 27 of them. So I think this is very important also to bring attention that this industry is expanding. It's not only a disinformation industry. It always crosses over also to hack and leak operations. It crosses over to security threats against specific individuals, targeting of specific people. And I think it's very important for us to be aware that the spread of this technology, the spread of this, these tools is very dangerous for everybody. I'm reminded actually that, in the introduction, the booklet that we received, there's a little quote from Josep Borrell, which says we need to work with democratic partners around the world to find information manipulation by authoritarian regimes. And I think that there's a very important distinction to be made here, because there's an assumption that disinformation is produced only by non-democratic or authoritarian regimes. But this is not entirely true. And there's also this association that it's basically democracies versus autocracies, West versus rest, etc. And I think that's also not a very useful narrative to use when, for example, South Africa is a multicultural democracy, and it is ranked on the democracy index above some European countries, but it is taking Russia's side for historical reasons, but also because Western narratives have not been completely successful in appealing to the rest of the world. So I think I'll stop here. And I'm sure that there are others who have legitimate security threats from Russian actors, particularly, of course, Russian dissidents, and of course, Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian activists. But in our case, in our part of the world, the situation is not as clean, and this distinction between West and rest is not as clear. And this almost gives free wins for Russian disinformation, not only Russian disinformation, but anybody who wants to push against Western influence.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Petchenko, you wanted to say?
I just wanted to jump with one very important point, which was mentioned here, why fighting disinformation can be successful in one places and why we lose that in other places. I would give you an example of one narrative which is very important in the global south. For example, the narrative of Ukraine fighting the liberation war. This is very, very important because actually Russia wants to portray that they are fighting their liberation war against Western imperialism, but that's exactly what Ukraine is doing, because it's par excellence the case of the fighting of liberation war against imperial power. And Russia is much more successful in persuading many audiences in the global south that they doing that and doing that successfully and trying to get other countries on their side rather than Ukraine, which is actually doing that. Why is happening that? There are a number of issues influencing that, but the issue number one, I think, is a long time established presence of Russia in those national narratives. The second issue, they really are very successful in exploiting the local problems and local conflicts, like food crisis you mentioned, military equipment supplies and other things. So, or the increase of the bread prices, for example. So if we would take two options in front of the ordinary people and say, what you want to support, Ukraine fighting for democracy and against Russia's attempts to annihilate Ukraine as an independent state, or what you would choose a higher price for bread. Of course, people would say, yes, we are much more worried about higher price for daily bread, and that's exactly how it works. So in order to be successful, you really need to establish this long-term presence in those regions. You need to localize your narratives, and that's exactly what Stop Fake was trying to do for many years, but again, with different success. For example, we have a French language service, and we target African countries as well for that. We also established a Spanish language service, and now increase the volume and presence in South American countries. But for example, when we established the Serbian service, we failed actually with opportunity to effectively enter a Serbian language audience organically. So of course, if we would have the same amount of money which Russia is spending on their disinformation, we would be able to do this successfully. But when you rely only on the organic interactions with audiences, that would not work, especially if you already start doing that when boys already go in. Also, we were trying to engage with Turkish networks you mentioned. So we established Turkish language service, which is quite successful. And now we also would be open an Arabic language service, because we really want to increase the Ukrainian presence in communication in those regions. And that's essential, because if you are not there, you cannot explain to people what is happening from Ukraine, or you cannot do that from the West, because they would say, well, this is another form of imperialism, and we don't want to listen to them. So that's exactly what Ukraine now is trying to establish, its kind of informational presence. But again, you should understand that we have very different number of resources which Russia is contributing to that, and what Ukraine can allow to also be visible and be heard over there. But still we do an attempt, because we understand that we need to talk to each single country, each single region, to explain what we are fighting for.
Thank you. Now, Tijana, you've, during your presentation, mentioned that some of the narratives we talked about are actually strongly supported by Russian official sources, even the ones that are present in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and yet Raskrinkavanje did thorough analysis and fact-checked them constantly. Did that have any implications on the security of your team and yourself?
It did. Yeah, we had a very, very unpleasant situation happening very recently, actually, last month, when the Embassy of the Russian Federation in Bosnia and Herzegovina published a post on their official Facebook page name-dropping us and saying that we, I quote, dared to call a story about US biolabs a conspiracy theory. And it's, as you can imagine, not the nicest thing to read from Russian embassy telling you that you dare to do something and giving you, again, quote, a friendly advice on how to behave. So this is what happened, and it was fitted into their narrative of anyone doing any kind of like fact-checking or criticizing the official Russian propaganda narratives as being, you know, a Western mercenary in a way. So what was also mentioned was some sort of like, I don't know, I'm actually not familiar with that specific story, but the story is about $80 million, as they said, about invested by the US into making Russia look bad, something like that. So apparently we're a part of that. So this was the reaction, not to any specific fact check that we did at the time. We did several of those about biolabs and bioweapons and that whole narrative over the course of the past 12 months, because it appeared a lot, and especially it appeared a lot on our radar, not just directly by, you know, being published by the embassy, which it was at the very beginning, but also a lot of these other conspiracy theorists like QAnon followers, etc. They really jumped on that narrative because it was kind of similar to something that they already had in their, you know, repertoire. So why it happened on that day? I think it was because there was a new wave of that narrative being put out there by a Russian general who now came out with the COVID version of that story. So it was no longer a bioweapon targeting Russian DNA. It was now evidence, as they said that their, quote, special military operation provided them with 20,000 pieces of evidence that there were biolabs and that they were being used to modify or create COVID, like SARS-CoV-2 virus. And it was rebutted by a Pentagon spokesperson on the very next day, and in the like a maneuver of unprecedented irony, the Russian embassy mentioned him as a source that confirmed their story and the proof that we were not telling the truth in our work. So it was wild, as their posts tended to be in the past year, but it was a very clear message to us that they're like looking at us and observing what we're doing. And the scarier part of that, I would say, was that on the very same day, it was immediately transferred by all of these media in this thing that I would call a disinformation hub. And I'm not calling it that just like out of my own personal opinion. We did a research in 2019 where we used algorithm to kind of calculate for us who takes this information from whom, and like what are these like hubs and networks of media that are connected that kind of churn out political disinformation. And we did find that there is one, and we did find that there is certain regularity and consistency with and frequency with which certain media, again, most of them in Serbia and a part of them in Bosnia and Herzegovina, mostly in Republika Srpska, use each other as sources and republishers of the same disinformation targeting political topics. Political in local sense, like the elections in Bosnia, etc., but also geopolitical and global topics such as invasion in Ukraine has become. So this network, this hub, which includes some of the public broadcasters, including those in Serbia, including those in Republika Srpska. It included a news agency as huge as Tanjug. It included a news agency, public news agency, Srna in Republika Srpska, etc., immediately, you know, spread that further, that there is something called raskrinkavanje in Bosnia that is being paid by the US to lie about what US military biolabs are doing, and that the Russian embassy has kind of like, you know, onto us. So that happened very recently. It was February the 2nd or something like that when this was published. This was really new for us. We have been targeted and attacked by various people, mostly those like people who kind of peddle conspiracy theories, but we have never ever had an embassy of a foreign state, right, like doing the thing that the Russian embassy did.
You're here today. Mr. Turčala, what are the other ways that Russian influence is present in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the region? Would you say that it's structuralized, that it's centralized, and what is kind of the role of local actors in all that?
Well, Russia attempted to streamline its influences in the region at some point just before the COVID, introducing the Gorchakov Fund in the region by like organizing some of the presentations or launching this fake report about Srebrenica, discussing it even in Sarajevo. But what Russia, or how Russia has it easier in the region and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is that it has mainstream political parties volunteering for Russia's goals. Russia doesn't have to actually invest any finances or efforts like it does, for example, in Bulgaria, to play actually or have the same impact in Bosnia and Western Balkans as in some other regions. On the other hand, Russia is a master in exploiting frozen conflicts and maintaining it. And here again, it comes into play that Russia has this support by mainstream politicians, but just trying not really to diagnose how Russia plays its role in the region, I will try to actually look for a solution. And the first step should be resolving the open border questions with Serbia. When Serbia accepts Bosnia's borders as such, it might signal that Serbia is not looking for some political corrections of Bosnia's borders, which are really very similar to how Russia did it with its borders with Ukraine, Georgia, etc., like implementing this violent border politics there. We see in the statements, for example, of entity of Republika Srpska government that they are not even hiding it, that Russia and Serbia open or silent support these moves that could threaten the sovereignty of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The first step would be really just to try to resolve these open questions with open border questions with Serbia. The second step, just to stop this appeasement policy that I mentioned just before. Currently, what we have is appeasement policy by the Western Division of International Community in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And on the other hand, where Russia succeeded, or where Serbia and the Serb Orthodox Church actually succeeded, is to make Montenegro as a NATO country actually trapped into kind of frozen NATO membership, because there are no consequences on the ground that Montenegro is a NATO member. We see this upheaval in the Montenegro, and what the NATO countries are doing, they are just looking and trying to figure out how actually to appease all of the actors to prevent some civil unrest or some like kind of low intensity conflict in a NATO country. And I think as in the way how the international community acted when imposing the sanctions on Russia for aggression on Ukraine, it has to act the same way in the Western Balkans. The appeasement policy has to stop. If it doesn't stop, it really will bring enormous political and security challenges, notably put challenges to the Western Balkans.
Thank you. Now to move more over to the journalistic practices. Maria, you're a journalist, but also someone who kind of monitors the work of other journalists in the region. What would you say are the biggest challenges when reporting on something such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Not only the ones coming from outside, but also the ones looking inwards.
Well, there are many challenges. Of course, this is the era of challenges, a lot of falsehood in the public space. But if I had to choose one challenge, that would be definitely our own journalistic biases. And I believe that, of course, this is not an ordinary situation. The war comes with a lot of passion, a lot of rage, a lot of hatred, a lot of hurt, a lot of feelings that actually gives you a lot of mental fog when you're writing an article. You can very easily slide from journalism to propaganda out of good intentions. Actually, you as a journalist, you want to empathize with victims in Ukraine, for example, and you want to be on the right side of history. Of course, this is something that is humane and that is righteous, and we are, at the end, we're only people, we're only human. When I say we, I mean journalists. We're not fact-checking machines, but this is a time where we have to be very, very cautious, because we know, for example, especially we journalists from the Balkans, we know how it feels to live in a post-conflict war, and we remember how but in post-conflict times, we remember how journalism once failed miserably in 90s, and how journalism in the media were used. They actually allowed to be misused by the governments to prepare the war, to pick a side. I believe that you as a journalist can be on the right side of history, but at the same time staying loyal to not this or that side, to us or them, pick a side, but to stay loyal to the truth. If the truth is, in this case, in some particular fake news, for example, that you are debunking, if the truth is on the side of Russia, then it's okay. We are going to stay by the truth. We're not on the Russian side. We're not on Ukrainian side per se. We are on the side of the truth, and it's very important to bear that in mind, because we know we live the consequences. We people from the Balkans will live the consequences of the war in 90s. We remember and we live actually what media back then left us. A lot of hatred still going on, and it's going to be the same situation in Ukraine, in those areas affected by the war. It is going to be the same in 20 years. And what journalists can do in this case is be smarter than our journalists from 90s were. And I know many journalists now, unfortunately, who are professional in times of peace, professional and objective, that in some cases failed to be professional and objective because they probably felt the urge to pick a side, to be on the Ukrainian side, which is, as I said, a good intention, but in the end, it leads to falsehood. And and I would say that this is the biggest challenge. And I know in my own case and in case of my colleagues that I've been talking to for the last year, this war actually, since the beginning of the war, many of us started questioning our own biases. We started thinking about the bias and objectivity more than ever. So this war actually, with all due respect, of course, to Ukrainian victims and to all the suffering in the field, this war actually gives us an opportunity to learn, to us journalists, to learn more about our own profession, because this is not an ordinary situation. Many of us actually haven't faced the war ever. So this is unusual, unordinary situation that can make us more professional, more smart than we used to be.
Thank you. And in order to leave some time for the Q&A session with our audience, I would move to my last question. Mr. Fedchenko, it's one thing to report on the invasion. It's completely another thing to report from the invasion itself, so from Ukraine. What do you think are the challenges besides obviously security, the journalists and fact checkers and others from Ukraine face, and what kind of support do they need the most from abroad, from outside?
Yeah, it's a great question because I've been a reporter for many years and also was covering many conflicts and wars, and that's completely different. Either you cover someone else's war, or you cover the war you and your family lives through. Today I went to Facebook and looked how Ukrainians are writing their short kind of reminiscence of this day 1 year ago, and I was trying to recall what my team was doing. So actually we've been doing the same what we've been doing before, so we're just continuing our kind of daily activities. So for us it was just a continuation of our kind of sadly daily routine, because we've been in that for years, as I said, on one hand. On another hand, even till these days, and on the anniversary of the invasion, you might guess we had a lot of media inquiries and journalists want to talk what was your experience and other things. And then suddenly they asked me the question, well, you talk about Russian disinformation, but let's talk about Ukrainian disinformation, because if we talk about kind of journalism approach to everything, there always should be two sides. And we're always somewhere in the middle, and we always, question everything, and we're critical about everything. And I'm still a little bit kind of amazed by this question, because not only because I am inside this war, and for me the situation looks pretty much black and white, but I still kind of don't understand how journalists can remain neutral. And try to be objective for the sake of objectivity. It's very kind of technical approach to things. And I thought that we went through so many conflicts that we should really made a lot of adjustments to what we perceive as our professional ethics and how we look at the situation. And this kind of double-sidism is not helping much anymore, because in any case, you should take the moral stand on things, either you like it or not, because I've been spoken to so many journalists who went through, foreign journalists who went through Bucha, and the main idea from them is that we cannot remain neutral after what we have seen, So this is kind of a turning point, and after this we personally cannot approach the situation technically, just saying, okay, here we report the Russian side of the story, and here we report the Ukrainian side of the story, and at the end you make your own conclusions, So after Bucha, as I said, we cannot say that anymore, and I think it's probably the biggest change which is happening to journalism. When you are witnesses atrocities, it changes your kind of perception of your professional ethics completely.
Thank you very much. This leaves us about 25 minutes for questions from the audience, if anyone has any questions for our panelists. Yep, there's a hand over there. Perfect, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting and insightful presentations. And it is vitally important to have the approach to the fact-checked information, especially in the war times. And I'm Nina Khiladze from Georgia Journalism Research Center, and as the panelists have said, the Russian disinformation is not only affecting the Ukrainians and others, but Georgia as well. For example, the NDI's latest poll are telling that 1/4 of the ethnic minorities living in Georgia are blaming US in a Russian war in Ukraine. So the point is that we are doing a lot of fact checking in Georgia and of course in Ukraine, and Stop Fake is wonderful example of how we have to approach systematically to combat disinformation. But it is very interesting for us what kind of influence our fact-checking is making on the audience. Because we see how the Russian disinformation is affecting us on a daily basis, but it is very important what we are doing to strengthen the information awareness of our audience. And shortly, in my opinion, we sometimes are too poor in widening our area of efficiency, thinking out of bubble and being in touch of the audience is something very difficult for us. I'm wondering, how do you handle with that? Because fact-check information has no value if it's not reaching the proper audience. How do you reach your audience? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Tijana or Mr. Fichenko wants to take the question.
Yeah, this is something that I think all of us struggle with all the time. But I would, rather than answer like how do we do that, maybe caution against asking too much from someone that whose job is to kind of come up with factually based information as a rebuttal of something that's already out there and that you know that it's false. Because this is not, it will not give you the same opportunity to reach hearts and minds, as it said, as this information has. In this case, for example, like the Russian disinformation that is being published about Ukraine, etc. It's rooted in a lot of cases. It's rooted in really old and very widely received ideological narratives. And it's not reaching people's minds, it's reaching people's emotions. And fact-checking, emotionally presenting fact checks is kind of an oxymoron. You are required to be impartial, objective, precise, etc. It leaves you little room to be catchy, to be, interesting, etc. And it leaves you almost no room to appeal to emotions. So I think this is like a big debate in fact checking, like how do you find this balance? How do you find the balance between being this like razor sharp fact digging machine and being someone that is going to try to make an impact with that? Because you're completely correct. I mean, I can put out an information about something. If it doesn't reach people, if people don't want to read it or see it, or if they do see it, but they don't believe it because they are already kind of immunized against that fact, which in ideologies is the case, why am I doing that? And I don't have a good answer to that. We're trying a lot of different ways to kind of like approach people and reach our audiences. We did a huge research last year actually to see what people in Bosnia believe, how many of them believe conspiracy theories. Like the pandemic has been a completely world-changing experience for us because it really affected the way that people think about, and it made them much more susceptible to conspiracy theories and that type of thinking. And we really, I think that all of us at some point felt really helpless. It was just like huge avalanche coming at us, and we would like pick one snowball at a time. So we wanted to see like how can we do this better? Ukraine invasion is another such example. It's just like it's raining on us, and we are trying to kind of like, put out a bunch of small umbrellas. So I don't have a good answer. I'm thinking about the same thing. I think we all are, and trying to, experiment with different formats or targeting different audiences, and maybe like kind of tweaking how you share your content, and maybe try to talk to younger people and talk about media literacy and get on the pre-bunking train, etc. There's like a lot of those things that we are all trying to do, but you're really still up against a Goliath. Not in a sense of like this huge, amazing military power or economic power, but seriously, like the word disinformation comes from KGB language. This is the tradition that this machine has, and it knows how to use it. And unfortunately, it has a very fertile ground to use it in many countries, as we have seen, including this region. So it's a struggle. It's gonna go on for a while, and if anyone comes up with a good answer, please. My contact was on the screen half an hour ago.
Thank you. Other panelists also wanted to kind of.
I agree with Tijana on this, and I think it's an excellent question, and I want, as a journalist, to say that I feel the same. I can get very depressed when thinking about our impact as fact-checkers. However, I tend to bear in mind that as fact-checkers, we cannot do everything alone. This is not our own, only our battle. If your audience is like right-wing audience, very rigid, very biased, you don't have a room for changing their minds. I think that the answer might be to like aiming to more moderate audience rather than right-wing or radical left-wing, people who are very strict with their opinions. They don't want to change them. You cannot do anything with those people. Of course, there is a lot on educational system in your country or our respective countries, because people are like in general they have low level of media literacy. They don't care about the fact, they don't care about the truth. They care about those pieces of information or disinformation that go along with their own points of view, and we cannot do anything with that. It's cognitive bias. We cannot do anything with that. They don't want to hear, they don't care about the truth. But at the same time, I try to, from time to time, to remember that, to recall the fact that the same goes for journalism in general. Journalism is more about idealism than it's about the realistic approach and impact. For example, especially in countries like, I believe yours, or countries in the Balkans, you investigate something for 6 months or a year, and then you publish your extraordinary piece of article, and then nothing happens. You fight against corruption and crime, and then nothing happens after your investigation. But does that mean that we should stop investigating, that we should stop fact-checking? No, we should continue doing our work and hope for the best, hope for the impact. Of course, if a journalist personally doesn't feel motivated, or a fact-checker, to do this job, it's completely up to them. It's completely okay to go out of this profession if it becomes exhausting and if you don't see, but as long as you see some kind of impact, some kind of, you hear about, someone says, okay, I didn't know that your debunk actually convinced me that vaccine is okay or whatever. I think that maybe it's a very low impact, but we don't have anything better, I think.
Very shortly, so my answer is we don't have the answer to this question. Of course, fact-checking is criticized all the time if we're effective or not, but the problem is there is no other single instrument which can be as effective as fact-checking is. So far, this is the only instrument, and we just need to think how to increase its effectiveness and how to multiply its effect. For example, in Ukraine, we've been doing a number of things for that. For example, doing a lot of horizontal partnerships. For example, here we have my colleague from Text.org.ua and many other organizations. So we have different angles of what we are doing. So it's not like everybody is doing kind of daily fact checking, but when we multiply our efforts, we have a better effect. Also, we try to find any single audience which is interested in what we are going to say to them. For example, all my colleagues are going from one TV station to another radio station to any media outlet, talking to any group of people who is interested to listen. And finally, by the end of the day, it has a result, but it took years to build this system. So here I can quote Margarita Simonyan, who said, that's my favorite quote, "You do not build the army when the war started." So it's like Sun Tzu for disinformation, but still, you need to do it much more earlier to build the audience for what you want to say. Because if you have a great content, but you have no one there to receive that content, it's absolutely pointless. And also we did a number of international networks, like with our colleagues here, through International Fact-Checking Network, which comprise dozens and dozens of organizations around the world. We set up the system thanks to our Spanish colleagues from Maldita, called ukrainefacts.org, where you can find fact checks from all over the world, from Argentina to India to Australia to any other places, all fakes about Ukraine. So it shows that you can kind of bigger results by doing it internationally. And finally, last year, Internews conducted a poll in Ukraine asking specifically about if people can recognize fact-checking organizations as influential. And 16% of Ukrainians could identify Stop Fake as a media organization they consume and trust. So this is particular one, every kind of 1/6 Ukrainian is consuming it. This is paradoxical on one hand because they're consuming debunks, not the journalism per se, but the debunk of the disinformation or poor journalism or non-journalism, you know, but still it created the whole genre and people are interested in that. That means that we really contributed to building this resilience, which we talk in case of Ukraine, you know, but it took kind of a lot of day-to-day activities. And as I said, unfortunately, there is no better and effective, more effective instrument. Of course, we want to quantify on everything and say, that day we had so many percents, but then we had, you know, 100% of people, but we would never have 100% of people. But that doesn't mean we don't need to try to increase our influence.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. I think he already has the mic, so if you want to go ahead. Yep.
Thank you. As someone who monitors terrorism, I would like to ask about how terrorism is exploiting the war in Ukraine, but also related to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, how Russia exploited this and is directing its propaganda toward Middle East explicitly, and also the Russian propaganda machine concerning Africa. I think beside what Russia is doing in Ukraine, they have completely different approach toward Africa, toward Middle East, and even we heard recently how Russia is accusing the United States of sending terrorists from Syria to fight in Ukraine. How this alliance is happening between terrorism, Russia, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and also their disinformation directed in Africa, which is directed against also the West. Have you been monitoring this? How this impacted the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
Yeah, it's great that you raised the question of Afghanistan because it was indeed widely used by Russian disinformation, because even before the invasion, they were using this case to demonstrate that actually United States are losing militarily and politically everywhere in the world. And they were saying that the same would happen by the end of the day in Ukraine. So they were showing, for example, in their daily TV propagandistic shows the clips from US withdrawal from Afghanistan with a lot of people trying to get on the board of the last airplanes leaving and showing, look, Ukrainian collaborators of US imperialists, that's what's going to happen to you as well. And as I said, it was happening even before the invasion started. So for Russians, that was kind of the great case to use to kind of amplify US ineffectiveness, as they were saying, and also to demonstrate that Ukrainian regime, as they're calling it, which is kind of a puppet regime of the Washington, would also face the same destiny. And also that was a projection of the decline of US military presence, of course, and they were projecting it to the other countries in the region, showing that if you are relying on the US military presence, it's decaying, it's not going anywhere, so you should rely on Russia on that. And that was also about the buying of Russian military equipment. And of course, we are feeling sorry for all those countries who chooses Russian military equipment these days, you know, because, I mean, if they are looking for spare parts, they need to go to Ukraine now. In the fields, you know, there are many spare parts they can pick up from. But on the other side, you know, it was put in a kind of wider perspective. And also, if we speak about Africa, they were also creating kind of very customized narratives for them, saying that, for example, you should blame Ukraine on the food crisis. Also, I mentioned the liberation theory and imperialism and anti-colonial struggle, which is also widely exploited for Africa. And actually today we would have a Twitter space with journalists in Uganda to discuss this very topic, how specifically Russia is targeting this country and what narratives they're using. And of course, they are different compared to those narratives which they're using for Ukrainian audience or for Russian audience or for the Western audience. So it's very customized. And in order to be effective, to tackle that, you need at least to understand those messages they employ. But also, as it was said, Russia is pretty much relying on the old lasting relationships with those countries. There are a lot of people who've been studying at Soviet universities and received a Soviet education. And Russia is portraying that actually Russia is a continuation of the Soviet Union. So if you've been a student at the Soviet Union, you've been young, you've been happy, so choose Russia now because it's the same. It's not the same, of course. But they are still kind of employing this approach to portray that actually Russia is a Soviet Union and implying the presence in the region, the military power and political influence and diplomatic influence. And if you've been watching Minister Lavrov's annual press conference 1 month ago, he was actually repeated all these things, and actually he was very happy with Russia's stand in the global south. And he was specifically mentioning that not a single country in South America, for example, introduced sanctions against Russia. So for them, it looks like a real achievement. And they want to expand that to other regions. And they're also saying that, and we applaud the efforts of all those countries in the global south to withstand American and European pressure to put sanctions on Russia. So you are strong and we are proud of you because you do not follow their, this case, So they are understanding the weaknesses or creating the weaknesses. And also Lavrov mentioned another important thing. So why we've been successful, he said, been present in those regions? Because for us, it doesn't make any difference. We can work with left, we can work with right, and he forgot to mention with extreme left and extreme right, which is even more a bigger success for them. So they see it absolutely kind of apolitically in terms with whom they can work in order to expand their presence anywhere. And that also works very positively for them.
Thank you. Mr. al-Baghdadi also wanted to add something. Just bear in mind, we have only about 10 minutes.
I just wanted to add, just echo my Ukrainian colleague over here, because he asked the question, why is, Ukraine, basically, this is a war of liberation. This is a war against Russian colonialism. It is a war of liberation. And so the rest of the world should be very sympathetic to the Ukrainian narrative. And I agree with you that it should not be this close. Russia, after the Soviet Union, does not have an ideology anymore. At least during Soviet times, it used to have a communist ideology, which they could spread. It doesn't even have that. This is a nationalistic war of conquest. And so it should not be this successful. And I think this is very important for us to understand, because this is ultimately, it's not just about Ukraine, it's also about the West standing in the world. Because unfortunately, in the beginning, this was really explained and understood in human ways. And as time went on, it became more West versus rest, and more of the world is looking at this as Europe's problem rather than a human cause for liberty and dignity, etc. I think it's not so much of course, Africa has a different context from the Arab region, given history, etc. But I think it's not so much about Russian influence, prior Russian influence, as much as anti-Western historical attitudes. Keep in mind that Africa and the Middle East were colonized by European nations. And during the time of colonialism, the countries that were colonizing the region were democratic at home. Whether it is, France or the United Kingdom, for example, they were democratic at home, but at the same time, they were engaged in this deeply hypocritical double game of saying that it's democracy for us, but you have to prove that you are ready for democracy, which is unfortunately a narrative which is still used in some circles in the West. So I think this is one of this anti-Western, existing anti-Western sentiment is something that really helps with Russian disinformation. I think also it's very important for us to understand, I'm talking from my own region, from the Middle East and North Africa, and I'm talking about like 500 million people in a large area, and a region of the world which has above average internet penetration. A lot of people are online. people will always look at the closest example for them. Like they will always look at the most, at what is most relevant to them. And there is one word that you can say anywhere from Morocco to Iran and from Turkey to Sudan, and people will it will highlight Western double standards and Western hypocrisy, which is Palestine. Because here you have another country which is also under occupation, which is also facing military occupation, erasure. But in this case, the West is absent. And sometimes it's the same action. If it's taken in Palestine, the same action is taken by Russia. It's completely, like it's covered in a completely different way. So I think this is not just about Palestine, it's really about Western credibility on the world stage. And this is something that, unfortunately, Russian networks exploit very, very deeply. They're very good at exploiting this because they know that this is what people already believe. This is what people already want to believe. And in many cases, they're not really producing fake news. They're simply boosting existing grievances and existing perceptions of double standards. I'd add also to the benefit of my Ukrainian colleague that I think one of area which you can achieve a very big breakthrough is Syria, because there is an organic grievance by many Arab people towards Russia's actions in Syria, and there is an organic sympathy that some of the loudest people who are pro-Ukraine and continue to be are really people who are anti-Assad and people who saw what Russia did sometimes it's the same murderers, the same people who are persecuting the war in Ukraine are the same people who, persecuted massacres in Syria. So I think this is one pathway to creating a Ukrainian narrative that can appeal to people outside of the West.
Thank you. Do you want to say something? A very brief follow-up, what you said. We've seen things that exactly as you described, they're not disinformation. It's not something that's made up that is factually incorrect, but it's just like a playing on existing grievance, and it's playing on existing sentiments. And Syria is a really interesting example because in some circles that we have seen, even that is being exploited to Russia's advance, not as much to Russia's advance, but against the West. So the narrative would go, so now you're talking about Ukraine, but you did not talk about Syria, even though that's utterly, nonsensical because everyone was talking about Syria. But we're not talking about the Syria, even though Russians were killing people there, but you didn't care because those people were Muslim, and in Ukraine they're not. So we're even seeing that. And it's not a thing that's necessarily fact-checkable because it's more like playing at a sentiment, but it's being used. It's being used heavily. And another thing that is so important to mention, and that both of you have mentioned, is this like how ideologies play here. So if you have like an anti-imperialist discourse, an anti-war discourse, anti-colonial discourse, it's going to be used for like huge I think Factograph, our colleagues from Croatia, called it like a tidal wave of whataboutism that happened when the invasion started in the media and social networks in the region. Because you couldn't see as ironically as like high anti-war sentiment as you saw, for example, when Iraq was invaded, as when Ukraine was invaded. So the same people would not be as loud because their view of anti-imperialism or anti-colonialism is only if it's the West doing it. So those are really complex, it's way more complex, and maybe returns us back to your question. Like Russia has a ready-made narrative for the right, for the left, for the extreme right, for the extreme left, for people in the middle, for everyone. And this is one of the examples where it's really hard to address all that and kind of still stick with the facts and remain at the field of, we're dealing with information and facts against disinformation. It's much more complex than
I'd
that.
even add that sometimes Russian networks will say the exact same thing and its exact opposite to different audiences, because they're not, in the end, they're not aiming for consistency, they're aiming for maximum psychological penetration.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's already 12 o'clock, so we won't be able to take any questions now. Thank you, everyone, for the fruitful discussion, and thank you, everyone, for being here. We can continue the discussion over lunch. Please join us at lunch on the second floor here. Thank you.